Okay, welcome to the video cast of the sixth lecture in this series for Gen Body Performance. This one we're looking at virtual bodies. If you have any information about copyrighted protected images used in this presentation, please get in touch with me and I will make sure they're taken down. I want to open with a copyright protected image. This is a recent campaign run by the UN about the ways that search engines demonstrate some of the problems that we have in our virtual world. What happens when you type "women should" into Google? What does it come up with as its prompts for commonly searched terms that start with that phrase? Well, what seems to happen is that you get some rather unpleasant things come up. Women should be slaves, women should stay at home, women need to be put in their place, and so on, revealing some really quite fundamentally nasty sexism underlying a lot of the way that the internet gets used in English. But that's by way of a little vignette to start us off. The main bulk of today we'll be looking at the ubiquity of code, online identity, and the issues around surveillance and sorting. By way of introduction, to say that we exist in code, and by code this means software, not just the internet. It's a relatively recent phenomenon historically that our lives have become invisibly virtual. We do things every day that we don't really think about. You put your credit card in the fast ticket machine and it recognises that you previously booked something online and spits a ticket out. You can sit in a lecture theatre and exchange instant messengers of various kinds with each other, or indeed with people in countries far, far away. When you are in a particular location, you can get you can get geographically specific ads on your mobile phone website, and indeed increasingly on laptop under Wi-Fi connections. Google and others have worked out geographically where they are and will serve you adverts based on those geographic locations. As individuals, we all show up in online databases. We have these parallel lines that exist online. So when we talk about virtual geographies, we're not just talking about things like World of Warcraft. We all leave a virtual digital footprint. And there are issues of power which are embedded in those virtual lives. And the reason that there is that power is because code is ubiquitous. Now, if we think about networks and technologies and infrastructures, work by Kaiko and Swingadoo looked at what they call the urban dowry, the networked infrastructure that we now take for granted. When you think about things like dams and sewers, and the water supply, these used to be celebrated. These used to be things that people visited in the urban landscape. People would drive out, take a train out to the Lake District to see a dam. Now we don't think about those kind of things. We don't think about water supply and gas pipes and so on. Now an urban dowry that's technological infrastructure, it's invisible. We don't think about it until it breaks. Then things become uncanny and strange. And this is the point, that things which were once new become normal. Smartphones seemed like witchcraft 5 years ago, and now we don't think about them. In 1982, a ZX Spectrum was the coolest possible thing that you could have. And it was a radical idea, the fact that you could have a computer in the home. Whereas today, a house that doesn't have some manner of computing device would be abject. It would be peculiar and strange and deviant and wrong. Similarly, in the 1990s, the internet was an exciting thing. Today, a house without broadband access or without a connected device on 3 or increasingly 4G, that would be abject and strange and deviant and wrong. How do you live your life today without access to the web? Well, there are people who do. People who, for reasons of poverty or of education or of personal choice, don't have access to the internet. But there are questions of power around it, particularly in terms of poverty and education. How do you choose to engage with these virtual worlds which are increasingly led online. Now, the point that gets made by Dodge and Kitchen is that the internet is merely the tip of the iceberg, that code is everywhere, it underlies everything, it's ubiquitous, it's not something that is remarkable. And Dodge and Kitchen have two key concepts that we use to help understand this: technicity and transduction. Technicity, fairly straightforward, it's the capacity of a technology to make changes to the world. A mobile phone allows you to be connectable at all times at some distance. Even sitting here in San Francisco as I do this, I can be rung up by anybody in the UK and they can speak to me, although it is very early in the morning in UK time when I'm doing this. So that's technicity, capacity of technology to make changes. Transduction is a little bit more complicated. It's how we remake space constantly through our actions. So it has elements of performativity about it. So the code is fundamental to this transduction, to this remaking of space through action, because code is fundamentally wrapped up with our lives. Now, the interaction of code with the individual body works on a number of different levels. Again, these are Dodge and Kitchen's categorizations. So they talk about, for example, a coded object. Something like an alarm clock, say. It's got a millimetre square of silicon hardware. It's got some very simple instructions on that piece of silicon which run a digital display which tells the time. It only needs electricity, it acts independent of other networks. And if it doesn't work, for whatever reason, the world doesn't fall apart. You might be late in getting up, but the world keeps turning if the alarm clock fails. Now, a networked object, second in this typology, might be something like Canvas, our replacement for WebCT. You log in, a piece of gatekeeper software recognises you and gives you access to some of the data on the server, but not all of it. So you can click on lecture notes. Your computer asks the server for that data, that piece of data, which comprises a lecture notes. It's delivered back to your computer or your iPad, whichever, recognises it as a PDF, it displays it on the screen. So it's a networked set of objects. Now, the implications of that network are that there are gatekeepers involved. So as soon as you leave the institution, your access to those resources is denied. But one of the things about something like Canvas is that if it died tomorrow, we could still continue to deliver education. We can print out lecture notes. We could put podcasts onto other streaming audio services or indeed onto YouTube. You could actually turn up to lectures. So the learning process can still happen without this coded networked system. In the case of Canvas, it simply augments the process, it adds to it, it doesn't replace it, and it's not, education is not dependent on these online systems. Now, a supermarket, on the other hand, this is quite a different sort of appeal. So you have a barcode scanner, and it reads the number the barcode represents, it checks that number against the database, and it returns the price for that product. The till then totals up the price and sends a request to your bank, which is identified as your bank through your chip and PIN, to deduct the money from your account. You might swipe your Nectar card, your club card, and receive discounts off some of your products that you've purchased in exchange for giving that supermarket all of your shopping patterns stored against your name and your address in their database, so they can target their marketing more effectively at you. Not sending you vouchers for ice cream if you never buy ice cream, but sending you vouchers for nappies if you buy a lot of nappies. But the thing with a supermarket is that any one component of that system that I've just described breaks down, then the supermarket doesn't work. So a supermarket can't work without a barcode scanner. It becomes a temporary warehouse. If the tills stop working, there's no way to manually pay for the goods and services that exist within that supermarket, because you don't know how much any of these things cost, for one thing. The system knows how much they cost. The system keeps a record of what's sold. So a supermarket where the tills aren't working simply becomes a temporary warehouse. There's no non-code mechanism for selling goods in the traditional way. So a non-coded supermarket becomes abject. So in this context, code is incredibly powerful. And code is incredibly powerful in a huge number of contexts. Take, for example, air traffic control. If the electronic coded systems underpinning that go down, nobody's flying anywhere. The aircrafts can still take off and land, but they can't do it safely, and therefore everything is grounded. So to take this idea of technicity, generally speaking, a supermarket not functioning has a greater impact than an alarm clock not functioning. I mean, it's a bigger thing, it affects more people, but technicity is something which is co-constructed with the user. So, if your alarm clock fails and you don't get up and you therefore miss a crucial job interview, then that's going to have a much bigger impact on you than if on your way home from a job interview you go to a supermarket and it's not working, so you can't buy a microwave or ready meal. So again, it's this idea of technicity co-constructed with the user. Now, from that transduction point of view, we've got the relationship with code as a source of constant negotiation. So it's the way that our relationship with code shapes our lives varies constantly, depending on the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Now, Dodge and Kitchen define this in terms of code/space. Spaces where code of different kinds, software of different kinds, is essential to the functioning of relations. So there are circumstances where code is not absolutely vital, but in some cases it is absolutely vital. A modern car is a software-dependent system. If the software does not tell the engine to start, the car will not start. So it exists in code space. Now, they make a distinction between code/space and coded space, where code can transform space performativity, but that space can still function through other means. So you go back to the example of Canvas, which helps bring certain kinds of educational spaces into being, but we could still deliver education without Canvas. Now that was quite theoretically dense, so we'll move now to stuff which is a little bit less tricky by thinking about online identities. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, except that, well, that's changing. You are who you say you are. Well, that always used to be the case on the internet. In the very early days, people got very excited or very exercised about how identities could be masked online. You could pretend to be somebody that you weren't, and the season 1 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer had a theme about an online boyfriend of the character Willow, who turned out to be a demon called Moloch. And hilarity ensues, and its ass gets kicked by Buffy. But that was very much the old way of thinking about the internet. And what's really started to shift since the mid-noughties has been this idea of the internet not being simply a way of concealing identities, but actually building on our existing offline identities, augmenting, if you like, who we are in the real world. This is something that Magin O'Connor did an early paper on in 2005, looking at this transition between a separate online identity to an online identity that works in parallel to your offline identity. And they did this by looking at a website called babyworld.co.uk, a site which still exists, although in the UK certainly Mumsnet has very much taken over as the leading place for these kinds of discussions. And the fact that Magin O'Connor actually talk about cyberspace in this paper gives a good indication of the age of the article. I mean, cyberspace is not a phrase that we would use anymore. But in talking about cyberspace, they developed this idea of cyber/space. the intersection between real and online lives. Now that idea of cyber/space, that neologism, that never really caught on, but the idea that underpins it is quite interesting, even if cyber/space is rather clumsy. What they talk about is this idea that you can bring identities together. So your offline identity becomes critical to the way that you create your online identity. So discussions on Baby World tended to be dominated by white, middle class, highly educated. So they're kind of standard expressions of power. And in the interviews of people who use Baby World, a lot of the participants argue that their practices of mothering hadn't changed. It increased their exposure to ideas, but what they believed was they were actually validating their existing behaviours. Oh yes, other people do this too, so it's okay for me to do this. But what we get is this sort of idea that mothering becomes socially constructed, because of course the correct way of raising children is something which changes over time and changes between different cultures. There's no correct way to be a good mother. The way that Baby World seemed to function in this research was a way that parents could try out different ways of doing mothering, and different identities of mothering. They could chat to people undergoing similar experiences. And that in turn this set of activities online could partly construct or reconstruct their offline identities, which they, Madden O'Connor, termed as cyber/space, this kind of co-construction of the offline by the virtual. Now, of course, one of the things which comes along and stamps all over these kinds of discussions is Facebook, because Facebook was the first site to really take seriously the notion of these things being based around your real identity. You get to share with your social circle in a way that you might not share with that social circle by other means. So you might not ring people up, a whole bunch of people up to tell them about your breakfast, but you might post a picture of your breakfast up on Facebook. So it's the everyday banality, the images of real world adventures that get put online to be shared with other people. But this process reshapes your offline identity as well. You start to get things where employers have been looking at Facebook pages to screen potential employees. It's been a big problem in the grad scheme world. You have situations where people at events are taking photos purely to upload them to Facebook. And also the situation where people who you're friends with on Facebook, when you actually meet them in the real world, they might have more detailed knowledge when you meet them offline than they would have done otherwise. So they can say, oh yes, sorry to hear about your mum, etc., whatever it happens to be. So it has a shaping effect on your offline identity. And one of the significant phenomena here is the question of trolling. It used to be called flaming, but basically abusive, often homophobic, frequently misogynistic commentary that gets posted as comments on different websites. Tactically, people often use anonymity as a way of concealing their identity to send abuse to people. And this hit the headlines somewhat with Mary Beard, who's a Cambridge Dom, who appeared on Question Time in 2013. And she then had a whole series of web-based comments that targeted abuse towards her. My appearance on Question Time prompted a web post that has in the last few days discussed my pubic hair, do I brush the floor with it, whether I needed rogering. That comment was taken down, as was the speculation about the capriciousness of my vagina and the plan to plant a dick in my mouth. So really quite vile, misogynistic abuse, but hiding behind anonymity, the kinds of things that if you were to actually say these to somebody's face, you could potentially be arrested for abusive and threatening behaviour. One of the reasons that Second Life declined in popularity was the fact that trolling was not really regulated. The Huffington Post has recently said that you have to post your real identity in the comments, so that you can't hide behind anonymity and simply troll people. Second Life had no such regulation, and it became a place of really quite unpleasant and abusive behaviour by certain of its denizens. But the point of Second Life, which as I say has declined in popularity in recent years, is you can live your fantasy, you can build your fantasy, you can live in a 3D world and create a sort of fantasy 3D world. It has a very spatial quality, which is one of the reasons why geographers got very interested, but it has a very real economic geography as well. So the currency within a site, the London dollar, is exchangeable with US dollars. You can create, buy, sell virtual objects. You can make money in Second Life, make real money in an unreal world. In much the same way as you can do gold farming in World of Warcraft, where people will pay you to go and do the very boring activities that then give you access to more interesting levels within the game. But the thing about Second Life is this question of these avatars that move around this 3D environment. They don't eat, they need shelter. So why do people spend hours, days, weeks building houses and nightclubs and swimming pools? There's something there about creating a familiar environment, which gives a way to overcome the threatening sense of the new. There's something about the spatial metaphor to help comprehend the landscape. But there's also something about the way that these spatial phenomena in the virtual world of Second Life reflect some of the real world preferences. So studies looked at the way that men, the male avatars in Second Life, tended to stand further apart than female avatars, which again is something that you also see in real life. What you have within Second Life is a way to perform identity. Now, offline, we use houses and clothes and possessions as a way to construct ourselves, to performatively construct ourselves through the people, so that we have a sense of who people are through the stuff that they have. And the same is true in a virtual world. So if you built a particularly fabulous airship on your island within Second Life, that says something about your identity. And Second Life has exactly the same kind of capitalist exchange values of the real world. You buy and sell stuff that you desire to help shape your online identity. The only difference really is in scale. You can't build a house with a pool in Selly Oak. You can't build a fabulous airship in Selly Oak. But the principle of you buy stuff and you perform an identity is the same. Second Life is still active, it's passé, many enjoy it. I've spent some time in it and I thought it was extremely dull. Maybe I was doing something wrong. It's got adult zones, it's got mugging, there's been occasions of rape. It, for a while, had quite gimmicky uses for meetings, for real-world commerce, online gaming. Online learning. There was an attempt to build a University of Leicester Island as a place for studying. Law firms used it for a little while as places for meetings, but it was always very gimmicky. We actually used it as part of our risk management training for master's students looking at hazard risk assessment management, because it's a way of being able to go and inspect virtual buildings without having to build hazardous environments to go and inspect. Other people have used it in quite interesting ways. Gordon and Koo did a project where they used students and community members to engage in creative placemaking, but basically they try to get people to build a virtual Boston and reshape it along the lines of the kinds of things they would be interested to see in the actual Boston. Now, CAD, GIS are very expensive, very difficult, very technical to use. So building things within Second Life gives people a chance to do some quite interesting things. You have participants in the same room, so they were talking to each other as they were collaborating on a virtual construction. And the researchers encouraged people to fantasize about what kind of things they would like. But the participants were sort of saying, we don't really need to put unicorns into our virtual Boston to make it fantasy. The idea of simply replanning the city was fantasy enough in its own right. It's kind of an indication of just how distanced people are from the power to remake their urban environments. The actual outputs of this were pretty lame, to be entirely honest. There's some photos hanging on a virtual public square, or a sense of, oh, here's a sort of 3D, a crude 3D rendering of the city. The thing with this project was that very few of the participants actually developed the skills to do any of the design themselves. They were reliant on the undergraduate students to help them, so the sort of affective capacity to actually do the virtual creation was lacking. So despite being in a virtual world with a virtual body, the way that you interact with that space is still highly dependent on your physical body. You can't replan the fantasy city even without significant skills, just as you can't replan the real city without significant skills and significant power. Now, if we turn to look at gaming, gaming has the idea of identity deeply embedded into it. And the thing about gaming, although the graphics have improved massively over the years, the sort of fundamental principles of gaming have been very long established. The massively multiplayer online role-playing games of the kind of World of Warcraft developed out of early text-based multi-user dungeons in the 80s and the kind of graphical online games of the early 90s. Now, the big difference between gaming and something like Second Life is in having distinct objectives. There are things to do rather than just to perform identity. There's strategy, there's team building, there's a strong sense of community, there's particular kinds of online socialization, particular kinds of languages that arise around that, the contempt for noobs, and so on. But there's a tension here between fantasy and reality, is something that Schwartz investigated in 2006. That games are actually real. They're experiences which can be shared, even though they happen to be in a virtual space. They have a real community, a real sharing that has material effects in the world. The activities might be fantastical. You don't generally get to shoot at people in the real world. You don't get to beat up mafiosi or cut the heads off a unicorn in the real world. So there's tension between the community elements of a gaming practice and then the activities which are fantasy. Modern games in particular can be consumed in quite a tourist fashion because the games have got so big, in much the same way that Second Life is very big, that there's a certain amount of grazing and exploring that can be done. And the technology can actually create a very high degree of realism, but of course too much realism can be very dull. You can very easily create a world where you have to commute along an elevated highway in heavy traffic, but who wants to do that? So there's an emphasis very much in gaming on fantasy, doing the kinds of things in the virtual world that you would never get to do in a real world. Now, that might be violence, or it might be wandering around 14th century Japan. It might be playing football with both Pelé and Becker on the same pitch. But the other thing to say is that in the sort of gaming world there is some wild misogyny going on. Because these virtual worlds are constructed in the context of the real world. There's the masculine fantasy of the ideal woman, therefore create the presence of hypersexualized women online as a projection and reinforcement of real-world sexism. And of course, this gets very deeply connected with pornography as well, setting new expectations for real-world sexual partners based on the fantasies that have been seen in porn. But it's not just about hypersexualized women. If we draw on Edward Said's work on Orientalism, you can read games through a landscape which sees the West constructing the East as exotic and dangerous, so you tend to get crude caricatures of foreigners within games. But the connection between the real and the online can be read via the lens of affect. Sean Wolfe talked about this in 2009, but we're talking about the sense of peril while playing games, the frantic attempts to escape, the mashing of buttons, and that sense of peril of an emotional, physical response to what you're seeing in a virtual world was as true of Pac-Man as it was in the modern person 3D shooter. We can become immersed affectually within these spaces. Indeed, that's something that game writers want to do. They want you to empathise with the character. If you have an empathetic connection with the character, you're more likely to stay in the game, you're more likely to buy the next upgrade, you're more likely to continue subscribing. So there's a bleed here between this virtual empathy, this virtual affective connection, and the real world of capitalist consumption. And increasingly we're getting a connection virtual and the real body filtered through sense perceptions, filtered through new kinds of control mechanisms, the forced feedback controller initially, but also things like the Wii and the Kinect, which place the physical body into the virtual space. So we start to get a commodification of the senses beyond simply the visual. There's more going on here. It's a much more immersive physical experience when you start using a Kinect. The final section from today's lecture is issues around surveillance and sorting. Now, we've already dealt with a little bit of this in an earlier lecture, because we often talk about capitalism and the power of capitalism. We tend to forget that capitalism is not the only power in this world. The power of the state is still very strong, and the state uses code as a means of controlling bodies. So if we look at the airlines, we've seen sorting systems like CAPS, which identify problem bodies automatically, the kinds of bodies that need additional screening versus the kinds you can pass through unhindered. Giorgio Agamben's State of Exception from 2005 talked about a permanent state of emergency, a permanent state of invasive control, so that the power of the state was using the threat of terrorism post-2001 as a way of reinforcing its own power by constantly intervening, because that reinforces the power of the state, which of course is made up of people who like having power. We have to think of this in terms of the change, the big change that's happened since 2001. During the 1980s, when the IRA were routinely bombing mainland UK, if we had turned around and said, we're going to take naked pictures of you every time you fly and store them in a government database, then nobody would have stood for this. No US citizen would have stood for that. The US government would have stood for that. But post-2001, the discourse has changed. The full body scanner is increasingly common. These exceptional powers have become the norm. And when you conceive of these things, we basically come down to the problem of mobility, because for increasing security, you want nobody to move at any time. Whereas the power of capitalism wants everything and everyone to move completely freely, because that generates economic activity. So this tension between wanting nothing to move and wanting everything to move has to be reconciled, and the way that these things are reconciled is through coded sorting. We identify the bad guys, but we let the good guys move freely. And CCTV has become a key mechanism for undertaking this kind of sorting. Now, a lot of CCTV is dumb. It's not interesting. It's analog. It's not always recorded. It's reliant on an operator actually watching the screen at any one time. It extends the gaze of the human, but it isn't really sorting. You can go into the back of the mailbox and have a peer in at the guy sitting in front of terminals looking at stuff. It's not very exciting. Its main function is deterrence. The possibility that you might be seen by a CCTV camera means you're less likely to shoplift, whatever it happens to be you want to shoplift. So in coded terms, it's dumb, it's unintelligent, it's not smart. It requires a human operator to do anything. But increasingly we have CCTV systems that are automatically monitored, that do some of the processing of this data themselves. So if you think about the London Underground, there are cameras on the platforms that automatically count the number of passengers that are there. They're used to model the flow of movements, to give information back to transport planners that allow them to determine what kind of services they need in given places. It's also a way, of course, of monitoring the movement of people around the system. More intelligent camera systems with things like ANPR, automated number plate recognition. This is something which in the UK we saw post 1993 after a large IRA bombing in the city of London. The so-called Ring of Steel was set up around the city, which effectively monitored all comings and goings to identify suspect vehicles. The bomb was planted in a car which was left outside a building. Thus, ANPR would allow people to automatically, in real time, monitor vehicles coming in and out of that area. It became the basis for congestion charging. In congestion charging, the ANPR cameras check each car's number plate against the database and therefore can automatically bill the driver. It's a state-empowered system, so MI5 know when you drove into central London, when you went, how long you stayed, as does the Mayor of London, so it can send you a bill for the fact that you spent a certain amount of time in the congestion zone. So it's a state system which is, yes, about capitalism, but it is also about social control. Creepier is facial recognition. This is a technology which is already live. It can be used to check for criminals and terror suspects at key locations. It was technology that was broadly developed by casinos to check for known card counters. Card counting is a way of cheating at various games of chance. And of course casinos don't like it if people actually beat the system, and so you tend to get barred. The idea is that the cameras can measure the geometry of someone's face, which is unique to the individual, and can quickly sort through a database of recognised problematic individuals who can be identified, and security can send in to remove them. These technologies can be misled through hats and hoodies, but increasingly they're being based on 3D geometry and skin patterns, so we're actually starting to get much more reliable facial recognition cameras. Now, with the new biometric passports, they require everybody's facial geometry to be recorded. It allows the automatic process through security gates. But it also creates a state database of the entire population based on their face shapes. So it raises the question of how far we are from automatic facial recognition cameras appearing on UK streets. So it wouldn't be about tracking the movements of individual cars, but actually tracking the movements of individual people in real time through real space, so that the whole city could become panoptic. Now that's a fairly terrifying prospect, and it's the kind of thing that people say things like, oh well, if you've got nothing to fear, you've nothing to fear if you've got nothing to hide, which is a facile argument at best of times. But the point about things like a worrying notion of automatic facial recognition is that this can only work through code. You can't have teams of operators watching people in real time. You couldn't do it, but you can have systems watching everybody in real time. Here's a less depressing story. If you've been on open day, I might have already told you this. It's the story of crime in Birmingham and CCTV Systems. Here's a crime map of Birmingham based on the 2007 Index of Multiple Declaration. Here's where some CCTV cameras are built. Moderately high crime areas, fair enough. But when you put a different map underneath and you look at where the Muslim population of Birmingham lives, you see a different story. You see that these CCTV cameras are built in predominantly Muslim areas. And what happened is that the Birmingham police applied to the central government to buy about 200 CCTV ANPR cameras to monitor Sparkbrook and neighbouring Moseley, as well as Washford Heath. And where did the money come from? Well, it came from anti-terrorism resource, a thing called Project Champion. Sparkbrook is a predominant Muslim area, and therefore you could get money to pay for CCTV cameras by accessing an anti-terrorism fund, saying that, well, this is quite a high proportion Muslim population, we want to monitor them. And the ANPR cameras basically formed a ring of steel around Sparkbrook, monitoring people coming in and out of the area. There was no consultation about this. The cameras just started appearing. People in neighbouring Moseley went nuts because they're level do-gooders and they don't like having all their movements through Sparkbrook monitored. People in Sparkbrook suddenly realised they were being targeted. And they're being targeted because they were Muslims. Muslims being seen as a problematic group in need of police surveillance 24 hours in all streets or movements at all times. It becomes disturbing and problematic and worrying. Now, a generous way of talking about this is that it wasn't really a case of the police singling out Muslims. They just saw a pragmatic opportunity to generate a revenue stream to buy CCTV cameras for crime prevention. That's a generous interpretation. A less generous interpretation would be they took advantage of a racist system. They used demographic modelling to identify a target area where a lot of Muslims live. Muslims are dangerous, therefore we will watch them at all times. This particular funding stream sorted particular bodies inscribed with a particular ethnic and religious identity. They sorted those bodies into a category labelled threatening, and then implemented a software-driven system of monitoring to resolve a socially, technically constructed problem of what to do about Muslims. Now that is not a cheerful story. But it caused a massive local and national uproar. The police were made to look ridiculous and racist, frankly. It was a huge setback in community relations. It validated voices within the Muslim community, more extreme voices, that were saying Muslims are being persecuted. It actually had a counter effect for what they wanted, which was to increase safety. It resulted in a humiliating climb down. The cameras were dismantled and £3 million worth of public money was wasted. But there's lots of data that's out there, lots and lots of data that's out there. CAPS 2, the successor to the airport monitoring system CAPS, ran into difficulties because it tried to connect this public data to credit scoring data held by private companies. And this was just not to be allowed. But as individuals, we voluntarily give up data all the time. Every time you use your Nectar card, you're giving data about yourself to Sainsbury's. But a lot of the data you give is not particularly voluntary. It's only voluntary in the sense of if you own a mobile phone, then you're voluntarily giving location information to your mobile phone company, because the mobile phone company needs to know where you are in order to connect you, to properly bill you. So I'm sitting here in San Francisco. If I make a call now, they want to charge me a lot more money than if I'm making that call in Birmingham. But you're not really voluntarily giving them that data. It's just a consequence of the fact that you want to use their service. So it raised the potential for huge data mining. Now, the French telecoms company Orange part-funded a study by McCoy et al. In 2008, where they did actually get volunteers with some voluntary data logging on their mobile phones that could be switched off at any time. But what they basically did, they were trying to get a sense of where people went, what they were having conversations about, what they were trying to do. So it recorded the phone call history and a crude measure of location using cell tower triangulation. This was done in Paris, so you get a pretty good idea where people were because of the density of cell tower coverage within a big city. So across 6 months they did this data collection, and they also did a series of interviews with the people who took part. And it gave the researchers an opportunity to do a kind of crude mapping of people's lives, where people physically go to in space on a regular basis. This is a bit like that psychogeographical mapping that we talked about in week 1, with people having quite small lives, going between home, work and place of recreation. Well, one of the participants, Sandrine, who was a relatively low-level worker in the film industry, had a very active phone and movement life. She called multiple numbers, she used voicemail quite a lot. She travelled to locations across Paris and elsewhere, reflecting meetings and work and the kind of hustling of the film industry. So her lifestyle was reflected in the traces left by her phone, get an understanding of who she was by looking at her phone data. Benedict, conversely, had quit her job recently to have kids, but then she got divorced, so she was quite isolated. And in her pre-interview, before she started doing the data logging, she talked about her biography. She talked about travel and events and multiple work and professional contacts. She spun an image of the busy life that she led. But the data that were harvested over the 6 months contradicted that narrative. That she had quite a narrow series of movements in the neighbourhood, a small number of contacts, mostly close family, that having children tied her down, she was very reliant on her mother, that the narrative that she'd initially come up with was invalidated by the data that she produced. So it gives you a lesson about data mining, about the way that people will not quite lie, but will tell a particular kind of story. And Benedict changed her story when she was confronted with this virtual betrayal. So there's a big lesson there about researchers not believing everything people say, but also that the life in code can transform the way that people perceive life in the real world. That having been confronted with her coded trace, Benedict starts telling a different story about herself, a much more closed story. Now, Orange and other mobile phone companies could do large-scale data mining. They could build typologies of users. They could do things like, not simply saying change your magic numbers, we seem to call these numbers a lot, change to this number, but they could actually use this kind of data to target advertising at different kinds of users. Now, they don't really do much of that at the moment, but the capacity is there. You volunteer this data to them. Which brings us to Google. Because Google is massively connected to issues of privacy. Every time you make a search in Google, Google retains what you searched for against a record of the IP address that made that search. The IP address is the unique address related to your computer or your web server. These can often be personally identified. They can certainly narrow down to a geographic region or indeed a house. In 2006, the Department of Justice tried to subpoena these search histories from Google. They were trying to tighten up porn laws, and Google refused. But that was Google refusing. What's happened subsequently, there have been revelations in 2013, thanks to whistleblower Edward Snowden, that the National Security Agency has hacked the servers of companies like Google, like Apple, and pulled all this personal data out of those servers. All the data that you have given to those companies has also now been given to the National Security Agency, which raises questions about who owns your virtual life, who owns your data, who has the right to see it. Facebook has a lot of information about you and constantly changes its user agreement to say who can see what kind of advertisers can see your data and target adverts at you, because that is ultimately how Facebook makes its money. These are big questions. As is the Google Glass project, which offers the possibility of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users monitoring the real world in real time through cameras constantly connected to the internet, which has raised, of course, privacy issues. You don't know that you're being filmed at any given moment, so how do you consent to being filmed? And that film being automatically uploaded to Google, Google being literally able to see everywhere, everywhen, if this sort of technology became ubiquitous. And of course people have been protesting against this sort of thing, saying, you know what, if you are a Google Glass Explorer, as the pilot scheme members are called, you can leave them outside when you come into my coffee shop. So what have we learned today? Well, code is everywhere in modern society. It can render certain objects and processes non-functional if it breaks. Online identities can augment your offline identity or the entirely fantastical performance of it, but in all cases existing power relations will affect these. Coded systems of sorting and discipline are very much part of our lives, with discourse of security now making them very hard to resist. In the private sector, can also wield considerable power over our real-world lives, such as tracking of our virtual movements. So virtual life and physical life are entangled and constantly performed, creating new opportunities and threats in terms of flows of power.